I see my man in the background. KJ, no. KJ, no. How you doing, KJ? You doing okay today? Oh, you're muted. You're muted. You're muted.
I'm doing well. How are
There you
you?
go. I am doing fine. Better that you are with me. Um, KJ, no, he's a journalist. There we are. Teacher, journalist, specialist in the Asia Pacific region. He has a book. Um, you can find it on iacenter.org. And he is also on the China Report on Breakthrough News Network. KJ, I one of the things when you come on the show, I often wonder what can I talk to KJ about because there's so much stuff that takes place. So there's big news, fair enough. I think the news that I saw was I wanted to go to Victory Day for China, effectively the win over the Japanese. And I definitely wanted to go to the one in Russia. Didn't get the opportunity to go. I feel like I'm so close to China at this point because I'm where I am. I feel like it's a travesty not to go, but it's going to be very expensive. Um, I realize it may be an interesting topic that that is an unsung war, kind of like they said North Korea is a forgotten war that America fought. Well, China's role in the Second American War, I'm sorry, World War II, is really understated in the US. I don't even remember going over anything about it in school in the US. It's kind of like you get older, you start thinking about the war in regards to reading through the books, and you realize, oh, wait, China was also a major power. Oh, right, China's at the UN Security Council. Like they had a major role in fighting the Japanese, not to mention the Japanese, for all of the talk about the Nazis, Japanese were not that much better in regards to the way they treated the Chinese or the South Koreans, or the Koreans, I should say. Can we step into that? I think that may be an interesting, unless there's something else on the itinerary, like in regards to something big that is taking place that I'm unaware of. I think that'll be an interesting thing to go into, considering it's going to be September 3rd, where they celebrate the Victory Day celebration.
Yeah. So I think the first thing to point out is that the Japanese made the Nazis look like Boy Scouts. And I kid you not.
Right.
Just think about some of the things that you may know already. There was Unit 731, which was it was the biological warfare medical testing unit in Manchuria. horrific acts. Live vivisection, torture,
Oh, Jesus.
just incredible things. They made, the German doctors really look like Boy Scouts. And the leader of that was spirited away to the United States after the war, and then became very, very influential in the development of the US biological warfare program, which there is very, very strong suspicion to suspect that it was used during the Korean War against the Chinese and the North Koreans.
Really? I did not know that. I mean, I knew, see, this is what I mean. Like, I knew the German doctors and German engineers were taken to the US. I didn't realize that the Japanese ones were also.
Yeah, Japanese, the head of the Japanese biological warfare unit was taken to the United States and probably had a strong hand in the development of Fort Detrick, which was the main campus for research on biological warfare. I think it's pretty much well established. I mean, there's always propaganda that tries to deny. There's a lot of denialism regarding World War II and Japan in general. But I think it's pretty well established that biological weapons were used during the Korean War against the Chinese. There's so much evidence. And that this was probably done in Fort Detrick. And this is more tenuous, but there's a strong link to some of the research that the Japanese were doing during World War II. So that's one thing. Unit 731, if you don't know it, I think everybody should know something about Unit 731. We also know that the Japanese took somewhere in the range of 400,000 comfort women.
Yeah.
And comfort women is a it's a euphemism. They're really military sex slaves. The Japanese would essentially kidnap or trick young women into becoming prostitutes for the Japanese military. And they were kept in these like tiny pens and then literally raped nonstop. It was like an assembly line rape by Japanese soldiers. And the piece that most people don't, most people may know a little something about the comfort women. What most people don't know is that these women had a life expectancy. There was a death rate of somewhere between 75 to 90%. That is, 3/4 of them would die during captivity. So that's a higher death rate than frontline combat soldiers. And then this comfort women system essentially became the template for modern industrialized sex trafficking, in particular around U.S. military camp towns. So there's an ugly, ugly, history to the comfort women. Mostly young women from 14 Japanese colonies, but the large majority of them coming from China and Korea, and both which were. Korea was entirely colonized. China was partially colonized. So they would kidnap these young women. In Korea, they would be as young as 12 years old. Often they were, shanghaied or told that, if they came and worked in Japan, everything would be good. Their family would be treated well, and then they would be sent off, to a faraway comfort women station, usually near the front lines. And as I said, they would be raped nonstop, up to 60 times a day. And then very often, they would die. The Japanese referred to them as logs. They were considered to be just expendable military supplies. And then that mindset continued during the Korean War, when the Korean military would provide former Korean comfort women to American troops. And that was the genesis of the U.S. camp town system, where, tens of thousands of young Korean women were used as military camp prostitutes. And on top of that, they enforced a kind of Jim Crow regime in South Korea at the time. So anyway, it's just unspeakable. But the Japanese originated this system. And then also there was the Nanjing massacre, in which the Japanese killed off 300,000 trapped Chinese in the city of Nanjing. There's a movie which has just come out, which I think everybody should watch. It's called Dead to Rights. Dead to Rights. It's currently showing in American theaters. It'll just show for a moment, because this is the kind of movie that you cannot see in the United States. They don't want this kind of stuff to be seen. But you see what the Japanese did in Nanjing during the Nanjing massacre. And it's essentially a entire city of people that is trapped, and they are slaughtered daily.
Can I ask you something? It's part of what Japan needed was resources. The U.S. cut off the resources. They decided that they were going to go into China and take elements of China and use it as a resource. And correct me if I'm wrong on any of this. And they realized China doesn't have the resources that we need, in which case you have all of these additional people with even fewer resources to deal with, meaning it became a contradiction in regards to the way they were operating. Can you explain the breakdown in China? Because there was two things that were taking place simultaneously, which makes the battlefield, I'm saying fascinating, even though I know it's grotesque. You get a revolution where the government is going against the revolutionary forces. But then you also get the invasion by Japan, where the revolutionary forces and the government decide to work together to go after the Japanese. And somehow the revolutionary forces gets the backing of the US to become China, with the other group, revolutionary, or let's say the governmental forces going over to Taiwan trying to declare that the tiny island of Taiwan is somehow China as opposed to the landmass. How explain the breakdown? Maybe I guess what I'm asking is the historical context of the breakdown for the audience, for them to understand how the governmental forces were fighting the revolutionary forces. I think Shanghai Shek, if I'm getting this correct, I haven't looked at this in a while. But these two forces are fighting, but also the Japanese is in Japan, China, also, in which case it ends up being a war against the Japanese simultaneously.
Yes, it's a very complex history, and I suggest that you get Carl Jha on it to talk about it. It'll take about 8 hours, but it's worth going into. Let's get down to brass tacks. The simplest way to understand it is Japan is a very highly resource constrained country. It's a small island archipelago. The best way to think of it, I really think of it, is a bit like the United Kingdom, Great Britain. There's a tiny island that essentially conquered most of the world. In Japan's case, it conquered most of Asia. Now, how did it do that? Well, it did the same thing that the British did. It started with slavery. The Japanese were early slave traders. So if you go back to texts in the 1500s, the Japanese had what were called Nanban slave traders. They were part of the triangular slave trade with Portugal. And if you look at the time, you can see that they're Portuguese, Japanese dictionaries, and they have words that don't exist anymore in the Japanese language, but they're essentially words related to the slave trade. So you have somebody like a hitokadoi, which is a trafficked person, and you have the anguiadores. These are the slave traffickers, and then you have the anguiador, etc. So there's an entire vocabulary that was developed simply on the basis of slave trading. The Japanese were early slave traders, and they were part of the slave trade. If you look, there's a painting by Peter Paul Rubens of a Korean guy, and why did Rubens paint a Korean guy? Well, he painted this Korean person because we think this person, whose name is Antonio Correa, Correa probably being Korea, the last name. His last name was after, but we think that he was a slave that was bought by a Portuguese from the Japanese and then taken to Europe. And then, Rubens saw him and thought he looked unusual and painted him. And then we think that there's one theory, it's not the only theory, but, for example, Rafael Correa has the last name Correa. And, there's a theory that these people may have been descended from the first Korean slave. So the Japanese were taking Korean slaves and trading them to the Portuguese, where they ended up in Europe. And so we have to understand the triangular slave trade was not simply Africa, but it also involved Asia. The Japanese started early on as pirates and slave traders, and then in the 19th century, they were one of the first countries to modernize and westernize, and they were strongly influenced by the German Second Reich. That's why the Japanese military uniform is the uniform of the German Second Reich. So they imported, German technology and German military strategy, and then they rapidly became an imperial power. Probably the first time that they flexed their muscles as an imperial power was in 1931. And this gets to the heart of the resource question, because as I said again, Japan had imperial ambitions, but it did not have an imperial industrial capacity. It had already annexed Korea, or colonized Korea, in 1910, although that process started in 1895, really. Essentially colonized Korea for over half a century, but that still wasn't enough. It needed these real industrial resources in order to expand and throw its heft around as a military imperialist power. And
Right.
so in 1931, it invaded Manchuria, Manchuria being northern China, what we would currently refer to as Jilin province. It
Right.
invaded Manchuria. And from the viewpoint of Asia or East Asia, World War II started in 1931. It's when the
Interesting.
Japanese invaded Manchuria. And this is an incident called the Mukden incident. It's a false flag. It's a famous false flag incident. But the Japanese used that as a pretext to invade and then colonize northern China. And they created a puppet state called Manchukuo. Manchukuo meaning, the kingdom Manchuria. And inside Manchukuo, they created what historians have described as the equivalent of the Belgian Congo. It was essentially a slave state. It was a slave state that was powered by slaves that were trafficked from Korea and China. And because Manchuria had vast, mineral resources, in particular coal and iron, and then also vast grain resources, this was the industrial powerhouse that essentially built Japan up as this, regional industrial superpower that then went on in 1937 to, full-scale war, and then Pearl Harbor and all of that, World War II. But Japan became a superpower like the United Kingdom through slave trade, starting in the 1500s, but really, really accelerating in 1931 with the invasion of Jilin, of Manchuria. And again, historians refer to this process. There's a term called the Manchurian Passage, like the Atlantic Passage. These were millions of slave laborers that were trafficked into Manchuria, taken into concentration camps and worked to death. So if you can imagine the death camps, the concentration camps in Europe, and then you extend that period over, almost 15 years, a decade and a half, and you see the same types of images, people in barbed wire, starving to death, literally, flesh and bones, and they're being worked to death in these Japanese death camps, which powered the Japanese industrial machine, which became the Japanese imperial military machine. So that
Wow.
history is really important. And for the Chinese, World War II really begins at the very least in 1937, but certainly I would argue that it begins in 1931. How many Chinese died in World War II? Lower end estimates are 20 million. But I think if you take the starting point of World War II to 1931, then you have to talk about numbers close to 25 or even 35 million. That's how many the Japanese killed off. And so China was undergoing chaos, and it was undergoing a civil war. And at the same time, it was partially colonized by the Japanese. And of course, Korea plays a very important role in this as well.
KJ, these
Yeah.
numbers, these numbers are astonishing. I mean, like when we're talking about the Russians, what, 28 million? And for whatever reason, the Chinese sort of rarely add it to the numbers when we're talking about death toll. Like usually people say 50 million died. And those numbers are so high that it's kind of hard to wrap your head around. It's almost easier to wrap your head around the death of one person as opposed to 50 million. But to have 20 million Chinese die as a result of the war, that is not something we're taught. It's just not, just astonishing, just amazing. The Japanese, when they surrendered, this was the combined efforts of a better question. Why didn't the Japanese work with the Germans? I know they were teammates in regard to the war, but they didn't work together like the Allies. The Allies was coordinating strategy, coordinating attacks. I mean, yeah, you had internal fights and divisions, but for all intents and purposes, as a unit, they worked quite well together.
I mean,
Japanese and the Germans, not so much.
they were the axis of fascism, right? It was a
Mhm.
fascist axis. And the Japanese had a long history of coordinating with the Germans. As I said, going back to the Second Reich, the Japanese industrial machine is actually German. The Japanese learned the industrial techniques from the Germans. That's why they have that incredible, precision and, technological capacity, as well as the military technology and the military discipline, the military, even down to the uniforms. That's German. So there was this coordination, but it wasn't, tactical or operational. But certainly they were allied. Geographically, they were very distant,
Right.
and the Russians were in between. And so, once again, coming back to 1931, there was an army called the Kwantung Army. And this was essentially a state within a state. They were the kind of military machine that, that struck terror into the hearts of people all over Asia. But in particular, they were occupying Manchuria. And at its height, the Kwantung military was millions of people. It was incredibly powerful. But as I said, Manchuria was the industrial heart of the Japanese military war machine. And then when the Russians got into the war, they came down from the eastern part of the Soviet Union, and they tore the guts out of the Kwantung Army. And that's when the Japanese knew that World War II was over. They saw what the Russians did to the Japanese, who, the Kwantung Army, they had a motto, which was kill all, burn all, rape all.
Yeah.
It was the holy terror in East Asia. And when they saw that the Russians had wiped them out, that's when the Japanese, were rehearsing their surrender. So, but you're absolutely right. None of this history is revealed or told in the Western annals, and part of it has to do with the fact that there has been an incredible mystification of World War II in the West. It's like the Allies, the UK, and the US. They later, they won the war, right? And the Russians,
The
who
Americans.
fight
Just
are not even part of the picture.
yeah.
And of course, the Chinese, the 25, 35 million Chinese are also wiped clean of the picture. And also, you don't hear about Unit 731,
Mhm.
the medical, experimentation unit. You don't hear about the comfort women. In fact, the US has tried very, very hard to cover over the issue of the comfort women. Wendy Sherman, State Department Undersecretary, said, essentially, she said the comfort women need to shut the F up because they're making,
Really?
yes, yes, because she said, they're appealing to nationalistic sentiments, and we want Japan and Korea and the United States to ally, right? Now, think about this. Korea was colonized by the Japanese for effectively half a century. And 200,000 at least comfort women, Korean women, young girls were taken away as sex slaves, and more often than not raped and then died during that process of sexual enslavement. And they want reparations from Japan. And the Japanese have been completely revisionist. They deny everything completely.
How do they deny that? I mean, that's just a factor of history, right? That's like some people deny slavery. How do you do that?
Um, well, I mean, denialism is, it's a very, very large trend in Japanese politics. And the reason for that is, again, the current Japanese administration is the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party. They were constructed in 1955, and it
Mhm.
was essentially a coalition of unrepentant war criminals Japanese mafia, the Yakuza, and unrepentant war industrialists. This was a coalition of these three people that were funded by the United States. They're funded by the CIA. They took power in 1955, and they've essentially had, except for a tiny, tiny moment, they've essentially had single party rule in Japan. It's a unitary state. It's a single party state essentially in Japan. The LDP has held party power almost nonstop, except for a short interlude in around 2010. And so they control not only government, but they control the press, they control, the culture, etc. And of course, they control the textbooks that are published. And so they have worked very, very hard to revise Japanese history. From their standpoint, the Japanese are the victims of history. They were bombed, they had the atomic bomb dropped on them, they were, just trying to create a co-prosperity sphere in Asia. They didn't go off and, rape and murder everybody in, from Korea all the way to, the Philippines and Myanmar. They didn't do any of that stuff. It's all, invented history. The women who were comfort women were well-paid prostitutes who joined voluntarily. So this is the kind of revisionist history that's being put out. And then you have the American historians who are also assisting them. There's, American scholars who, say yes, yes. And then there are Asian American scholars in the US who also say, yes, women going out and being prostituted was an act of rebellion against Confucian, patriarchy, and sex work is liberating, essentially. So there are people who are saying this kind of stuff. So it's an entire industry of revisionism.
Now, I've seen the signs in South Korea commemorating the comfort women. And again, this wasn't something I knew about until that goofball on that YouTuber went and violated one of them, and the reaction to South Korea was just unhinged. Like they were beating him every time he went out of this hotel room. They would punch him, and they were tracking him as he moved through the city. He had to give this kind of apology to the entirety of the country itself. Like meaning, it cuts deep. You could see how deep it cuts in regards to the history of it. Wow, that's amazing. That is amazing.
Jamal, I met one of the comfort women when she came to San Francisco. Her name is
you?
Yes. And, I was interviewing her with my colleague at a local radio station, and he was having, a bad day or a bad time. His career was struggling. And so I said, this is an important story. We need to interview this woman. So he brought his recorder and we interviewed, and, I mediated the interview, did some translation. And at the end of the interview, my colleague said, man, I thought I was having a bad day.
I know. It puts it in perspective, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't imagine it. Like it's I think that's why I react so poorly to the way the US behaves. It's like when you read that stuff, and it's not just sometimes when we read history, we read it in this kind of mythical context. It's almost like you're reading Alice in Wonderland, or you're reading just a regular book. Like if you're reading a book about the Nazis, or if you're reading about, I don't know, some other book that's horrendous by a Russian author or whatever, they can blur. And despite the fact that this book is completely true and this other book is completely fiction, it doesn't feel that way when you're reading it. History feels different. It feels like something else. And it's like, no, those people really lived. Like in the same way you get up in the morning, brush your teeth, go to bed, hook up with rando person, do your job, whatever you're doing, play an Xbox. Every day, it's a tick of the clock. A person is experiencing joy, pain, love, hate, whatever. Arguing with your girlfriend, it's like, oh God, will this day end? Like all of those things are life. What does that look like when you're putting in a pen against your will and raped continuously by rando people? because they decided to invade your particular country. And then years later, you get a superpower saying, shut up about that. I understand. I understand. Just shut up about it. Shh, 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 be quiet. You're
Yeah.
against our geopolitical interests. Or in Israel, like what they're doing in Gaza, or even the war in Ukraine, where all of those people, like, imagine you're walking your dog, your poodle, and four goons pull up in a truck, kick the dog, and drag you and throw you into the back of a thing. And before you know it, you're on the Russian front line with a potato and a gun, and they're sending you out to get killed by the Russians. That's outrageous. But that's a life. That's somebody's life. It's hard
That
to put it in context.
it is hard to put into context, but from time to time, you get sheer tiny, tiny glimpses of it. Most of us, our experience is filtered through the media. We are not, subject to daily, torture, starvation, murder, genocide, although we get small glimpses of it. And, the little glimpses that we do get, we need to amplify that, and we need to, take every conceivable action, in order to, resist, challenge, mitigate, do something. But, just coming back to Yongsu, the comfort women. So we do the interview, and then, she's kind of, she's an advocate for, justice. And she says, I'm not going to die until I get justice. And the Americans want people like her to shut up because it makes Japan's remilitarization really, really inconvenient. The Japanese have wanted to remilitarize, and they're going to be part of this war against China. They've never given up their imperial ambitions. They've never given up their, designs to conquer China. And the LDP wants to remilitarize, most notably during Shinzo Abe, who essentially rewrote their peace constitution so that they could go to war anywhere with the United States. And they're de facto now a military power, and they're part of the Pacific pivot. And the US has tried to force Korea and Japan together into this brokered, shotgun marriage so that they can have a division of labor and be used as a military weapon against China in this coming war. But anyway, so people like Lee Yong-soo are being told to shut up. But anyway, as I said, she was here in the Bay Area giving talks. And after she gave a talk, people wanted to take pictures with her. So, she was nice. She's, at the time she was in her 80s, in a wheelchair. But, she was, doing her best, trying to smile and, do the picture taking thing. And one of the people who was taking pictures asked her, can you move over to the left and, be here? She's framing the picture. And I swear, Jamal, I have never seen anybody become so compliant in my life. It's like,
what do you mean? You mean her moving over to take the picture?
Yes, she was told to, can you move, 3 inches to the left? And I could see that there was something in her brain that shut down, and she reverted to this state of complete and total compliance. And I was thinking, yes, that's what she has experienced in her life. Other people telling her what to do and her having to shut down completely.
But
So,
KJ, it's just her moving to take a picture. What's the deal? I mean, what am I
what's
missing?
the deal? What's the deal? Well, they said, and they kind of came over and they nudged her over, and I could see that something in her shut down, and she went into this complete it's hard to describe, and I don't think anybody noticed it, but she went into this complete kind of shutdown. I could see that. Yeah, there was a part of her, I could watch her. She just took a sigh and she said, okay. And I could see there was like this incredible resignation. And then from then on, she was just putty. People were just moving her back and forth, manipulating her, etc. And she had no agency, she had no will. And I thought, man, she can go right back into that state of having no agency, because that's a place that she inhabited for a very, very long time.
I guess my thing would be, what was she supposed to say? Like, was she supposed to say no? Like, I guess I don't know the alternative in that one. It's is it just the sense that you got when she was asked, where it just seemed like she changed, like something, like a
Yeah,
light was okay.
like the light was turned off, like she received a directive, and it wasn't a hostile directive. It's just like, we need you to move. But once she received that, and there was something about perhaps the way it was said or the conditions or whatever, she became totally compliant.
It gave you
And
an impression.
I swear I've never seen anything on that level with a human being before. And it
Wow.
just gives you the sense that this there is deep and profound suffering, but also programming that this person has been subjected to.
But it also sounds like she's resilient. I mean, like, if she's making this argument, I'm not going anywhere. I'm not leaving this mortal coil until I
Yes,
get justice for what is taking place. That's
yes.
not defiance. Like the
Jamal,
US saying, shut up, and her
three
saying, oh, F off.
three quarters of the comfort women are estimated to have been killed during their enslavement, right? They were killed or died or committed suicide or died from ill health during their enslavement. So just the fact that you survived is extraordinary. The second thing is just the fact that you spoke up about what you experienced is extraordinary, because for 30 years, 40 years after the comfort women, everybody kept deathly silent. Nobody spoke up about it. I mean, it was just kind of completely buried. You went back, if you survived, you went back to your natal village, and you struggled to continue living. I mean, a lot of them had drug addiction problems because they were shot up with methamphetamine or opiates while they were being prostituted, which is not an unusual thing. So they were some of them were drug addicts. And then some of them went right back into prostitution. This is why we saw the continuation of the comfort women system in the military camp towns, essentially military prostitution, but this time for American troops. And then the other ones, I mean, most of them, they couldn't have children because they were sterile, they had forced abortions, etc. And then they just kept silent. If they got lucky, it's one of those things which is so deeply traumatizing. The best that you can do is forget about it. It's not something you want to bring back up on on the screen. So most people tried to forget about it. And there was one woman in Korea. There was one woman who spoke up, and she kind of opened the door for everybody else. And there's a line from Muriel Rukeyser. She says, if one woman told the truth of her life, the world would split open. I mean, this was the woman who split the world open, with her testimony. And then that opened the space for other comfort women to speak up. And then, it became a movement for transnational justice. As I said, 14 countries, were, inducted into this trafficking. So, and she's one of the pioneers of that. So yes, incredible courage, resiliency, determination. And, so yes, all of that. And that doesn't mean that she still doesn't have these deep scars and imprints and programming that her body and her mind still can fall back into.
Just to be clear, the woman who said, if one woman speaks the truth, the world will split open. I love that quote, by the way. That was one of the women that was a comfort woman.
No, it's a poet called Muriel Rukeyser. But
Okay.
I just think that that's a very, very, appropriate
Yeah.
description of what happened when the first comfort women or the first comfort women spoke up.
She was feeling very grandiose when she wrote that. She was feeling very grandiose. I don't doubt it, but Jesus Christ, if just one, just spoke the truth, that is so epic. Man, KJ, this is very dark. It is darker still that people are trying to deny that these women went through that experience. God, I cannot imagine, how do you go back to your village? Like, the war's over with, these rapists lost. And now you're saying I can go back home and do what? My life is torched. It's just, wow. It's like you're starting over from zero. It's just hard to kind of wrap your head around it.
Yeah.
Yeah, KJ, great breakdown, as always.
Let me
Great
tell
breakdown.
you. Let me tell you the second chapter, which is not a happy story either. After, for example, in Korea after the war, essentially South Korea was controlled by Japanese collaborators. So there are
Right.
people who had collaborated with the Japanese. U.S. Came into the south of Korea, and they put the Japanese collaborator class back into power. It's as if, the Allies had gone into Paris and put the Vichy government into power, and Macron was, the Vichy government. This is
Yeah.
what the U.S. did. So they put all the Japanese collaborators back into power. Why? Because they did not want the socialists who had fought the Japanese into power. So they put the collaborators into power. We saw the same thing in Greece. We saw the same thing all over, all over the world. But they put the collaborators back into power. So these were people like Park Chung-hee, who trained with the Kwantung Army, and who fought against the Korean, independence activists, and was trying to. Park Chung-hee is Korea's, military dictator for 18 years. He was actually in Manchuria trying to track down Korean guerrillas, of which there was an important guerrilla. His name was Kim Il-sung. He was like the Che Guevara of Manchuria. The task of his unit was to track down Kim Il-sung and kill him. So, Park Chung-hee was part of this Japanese killing machine. And then he became the Korean president, and before him, Lee Seung-man, etc. But they were all Japanese collaborators. A series of Japanese collaborators were put into power in South Korea. And one of the things that they did was, Park Chung-hee, one of the first things he did, or one of the important things he did, was he normalized relations with Japan. So he said, you guys.
After the war with Japan, he normalized relations with Japan.
Under pressure from the United States, but he essentially said to the Japanese, it's all good, we're all friends again, and you can pay us some reparation, and then we're good. And he took a tiny pottage of reparations. I think it was something like $300 million, and that money was supposed to go directly to the slave laborers and the comfort women, etc. And the government took the money. They did not transmit the money, or they transmitted a tiny, tiny fraction to the people who are actually being harmed, although they used that as a pretext for claiming reparation. The government took that money for itself, gave a tiny pottage, crumbs to the people that had actually been harmed, and then used it for its own, purposes. But along the way, and this is the second chapter of the Comfort Women that has not been told, or not been told properly, but which needs to be told, is that South Korea developed its economy on three things. And it's not what you're told in the economics textbooks. In the economics textbooks, it's the Walt Rostow model. Korea industrialized, and it developed itself, and in good planning and good, capitalist, good direction of capitalist market economies, and therefore it became a takeoff economy and became rich and prosperous and lived happily ever after. That is pure fairy tale. What happened in Korea's economic rise was it did several things. One is it had massive sweatshop labor, which is pretty,
Basically
standard. Yes, it's almost slavery. I mean, you talk to the people who worked in the sweatshops again, 12, 13-year-olds, they were being shot up with methamphetamine so that they could work 2, 3, 4 days without sleeping. They refer to them, historian has referred to them as circles of hell to make Engels and Dante faint. It's just incredible human exploitation, unthinkable. So you had the massive sweatshop labor, but you also had, and by the way, Korea's current president, Lee Jae-myung, is somebody who came up through that sweatshop system. He started working in sweatshops at the age of 12. He says he was, beaten within inches of his life, at these factories. He lost, he has his arm mangled, etc. So, I mean, he's, that's an entire show unto itself. But so people worked in sweatshops. Another big boost to Korea's economy was war profiteering and war remittances. What do I mean by this? From 1965 until 1975, South Korea was one of the largest participants in the Vietnam War. They sent over 320,000 troops to fight in Vietnam. After 1972, they outnumbered U.S. troops 2-1. And so they were a huge military presence. All these soldiers were getting, decent salaries, which then would be remitted to Korea, which again, the Korean government would skim off most of it and give them 10%. But even so, that was still, a big salary. So essentially, military remittances, mercenary remittances, along with military construction and subcontracting. So the big companies like Hyundai, the car company, that was actually a military subcontractor to Brown and Root, which is now Halliburton. So they do, military subcontracting for the Vietnam War. So that was another huge source of revenue for the Korean economy. And then the third piece, which is the piece that nobody will tell you, is that there was massive prostitution of women in U.S. military, camp towns, essentially brothels for the U.S. military, because the U.S. had a huge military presence in Korea, as well as for Japanese tourists. And the Korean government used prostitution as a deliberate strategy of gaining foreign income, of gaining foreign exchange. And so they would actually in the 1960s, half of the South Korean government's public health budget was used essentially to police women's vaginas in the camp towns. That is, they would force these women to have, STD tests and put them into quarantine. And, they had to wear like a little medallion. It was like a taxi medallion, except instead of testing your brakes, they would be testing your genitals. And they were forced to undergo these, invasive, tests all the time, so that the U.S. military could be assured that they were getting clean PUSSY all the time. And this was a kind of collaboration. Collaborative. It was a collaborative project between the U.S. military and the South Korean government. It was one of the perks of serving abroad, was that you would get, easy, cheap, and clean PUSSY for your troops. So that was part of the Korean, quote unquote, economy. I refer to it as sexual primitive accumulation, but it was one of the ways in which South Korea's economy was developed. At the time in the 1960s, we think probably 20-25% of South Korea's foreign exchange came through this kind of government facilitated pimping. The government was a pimp for the U.S. military.
KJ, we can end it on this, but I do want to highlight something. The way that intrusion into the society can affect that society for decades, if not centuries. I mean, like, Japan goes in, Japan creates the system, and it reverberates through history for decades, where it still was use in some way. I mean, it went from the Japanese using it to the government reforming it and saying, hey, we can make profit off of this. We can do something good for our economy using these women. And, we'll give them STD tests. They may be paid better. They're not going to be treated like the Japanese, so it's kind of better. Like your government, like it's a weird thing for something to be considered an atrocity, a trauma, and for the government to still go with that trauma because it's a profit-making enterprise. And of course, if people need money and they need resources, they're going to go into it. It's like OnlyFans, right? Would OnlyFans exist if people didn't need money and they can make money off of it? Probably not. It's there because people need the cash. Or porn, it's there because people need the money. It's God, man, that's grotesque.
But I think it's important to highlight that this is not choice. It's not people choosing to do it. It's that they're structurally coerced into do it. So in the capitalist mythology, this is mystified as people being agents and going into business for themselves. But if you really understand the structural constraints, we would see this as structural violence, structural that you being it would be an environment where you were forced into this, like in a workplace where you have no choice but to submit to sexual predation. In the workplace we would understand that, but in the marketplace we pretend that this is the choice of free agents, when I believe certainly for the comfort women, I don't think any of them would have chosen to go into that. And we know that the vast majority were tricked or coerced. But the Japanese mythology, and it's also the market mythology, is that these were free agents and they enjoyed and liked what they were doing, and they were making tons of money, and essentially they were sluts, right? I mean, it's always the victim blaming. But I think the other piece of this, which I think is really important, is you talk about governments or administrations utilizing trauma. First I object to the word trauma. I mean, we overuse the word trauma. I think the term that really needs to be used is oppression, because trauma is it's usually a singular event, and it's in the past. Oppression is ongoing and structural. Trauma is psychological, individual. Oppression is structural and collective. And this is an ongoing structural oppression that is not past history. It's not a past event. It's not a psychological event. It's an ongoing structural force. And that continues up to this moment. And inside that, there is not simply an erasure, but an active silencing. So what you experienced or what you are experiencing cannot even be told.
Wait, just so I'm clear, they're still doing this in South Korea?
Well, prostitution is still a very large part of the economy, and certainly the structural dimensions of the oppression continue to exist. It's simply transitioned into women that are being trafficked from other countries now. It's much less common. But in the early 2000s, the Ministry of Women did a survey, and they said that something like 1 out of 5 women between the ages of 18 to 29 had been prostituted. This is the South Korean government saying, 1/5 of young women have been prostituted. So yes, it was a continuing process. It still continues up to this day. From time to time, you get, little scandals like these K-pop stars, young K-pop women. Turns out that they have been prostituted because that's kind of an implicit part of their contract, is that they're going to serve, rich and powerful men. There was a K-pop star who committed suicide. Yes, these kinds of scandals, they pop up from time to time under the radar. They pop up from under the radar. So this kind of stuff is ongoing. And as I said, a lot of this, prostitution is now continued with transnational trafficking. As I said, the comfort women system templated the industry of transnational sex trafficking. And so now you're getting women from other countries who are being trafficked in South Korea, and also Korean women who are still trafficked into the United States and Europe, So this is ongoing. So as I said, It's not past. It's not even history. It's not even past. It's present. It's still ongoing. And so inside that, the really, the second layer of oppression, not simply the physical violation, but the second layer of oppression is the silencing and the erasure. And that is the other piece that also needs to be tackled and addressed. This is why this is news to us, right, Jamal? I mean, you and I, we're having this discussion for the first time. Why is this not in the news every single fucking day?
Well, like I said, the events that took place in the World War II from the point of the Chinese just weren't. It doesn't come up in U.S. media. It's not something that we talk about. I'd be hard pressed to believe they're going to carry Victory Day in Japan. I mean, in China. I could be wrong. Let me know if they do, but I suspect they're not. It just doesn't come up, even when they talk about the numbers. 50 million people died in World War II. It's like, okay, does that include the 20 million Chinese? No, it does not. So you can imagine the comfort women thing. It's not going to come into play if they don't even talk about the war. Like I knew about the comfort women. I didn't know the scale of that. Yeah, and look, you're right about the marketplace. I mean, all of us to some degree are compelled by our needs to function in a workplace environment. There are better jobs than others. So I agree with you. I don't know how many people would choose. There'd be some couples, there'd be some swingers who'd be like, yeah, I just want to get naked. But this is not really what we're referring to. We're talking about people who are compelled by their needs to function in that sense, like the Ukrainians. Like in, I think the poll had like 50% of the women that were prostitutes in Ukraine, or something like. It was some insane number of the skew between the number of women who are in society versus the women who are doing like OnlyFans or this other stuff. Oh, that is grotesque. That is grotesque. KJ, this has been illuminating. And I gotta be honest, pretty much every episode of you has been illuminating, so I thank you for it. KJ No, political analyst, commentator. KJ's specialization in geopolitics of the Asia Pacific region. He's contributor to the book Capitalism on a Ventilator. Once censored by Amazon, it is now available at iacenter.org. You can find KJ on Breakthrough News Network on the China Report. KJ, when is your next show? And if you did a show with somebody else, also plug your stuff.
Yeah. Well, I just recorded a show with Dana Showtime Burton, and we hope to get this out really soon. Dana has been living in China for a quarter of a century, but he is actually a hip hopper from Detroit. And
Interesting.
He's the person who introduced hip hop to China. He's the godfather. He's considered the godfather of hip hop in China, but he's lived in China for a quarter of a century. So we go over the development of hip hop in China, as well as the contrast between Detroit and Shanghai. And that's a very illuminating conversation.
Oh, that is interesting. That is interesting.
Because,
Because, in the US,
on your show, yes.
Well, in the US, hip hop developed in a particular way.
Yes.
Like, meaning it became, you could say art at its best is subversive. And it's very interesting how that works in China. In the US, it became a representation of what people were living through. And eventually became a parody of the representation of what people were living through. So it's, it's like, I have 50 guns. And if you look at me wrong, I'll murder your dog. And it's like, whoa, really? Seriously? That's the life you live in? And it's like, no, that guy's not living that life, right? That guy's parading that life. But at some point, somebody was living that life who put it into vinyl and put it into the record and said, look, this is what I live. This is my street life, right? This is my representation of reality. How the hell does that function in China? That is a fascinating question on how it
is
evolved.
A fascinating question, and you will have to watch the show to see it. But yes, absolutely. Dana comes out of the Black radical tradition of Detroit, and it's that tradition of speaking truth to power. And that's what he's done his whole life. And he's also speaking out against the anti-China propaganda. So definitely
interesting.
Yeah. So Dana Burton. And then I recommend people check out the film Dead to Rights. You won't see it for long, if at all, in the US, but watch it because it's about the Chinese experience of World War II, especially during the Nanjing massacre.
I actually think it's playing here. If I
check
am
it
not
out.
mistaken, I went to see, this sounds so bad, I went to see Fantastic Four. I could have swore that I saw that movie on the marquee. I will definitely check it out. Well, I'm leaving here over the weekend. When I get to my next location, I'll check it out from there. They should have it also. It's still in Asia. So, KJ, you are fantastic. I always appreciate you. The audience loves you. And I always thank you for joining me. I really do. You be safe, okay? Have a good day.
Thank you, Jamal.
Bye bye. All right, KJ is